Instead of apologizing for who we are and what we've achieved, I think we should not only celebrate it, but aggressively and intensely and assertively promote it, even if that earns us accusations of racism, imperialism, Eurocentrism, and whatever else are the tools that are used to shut us up. I just refuse to shut up.
Good evening. I'm Pete Peterson, the Braun Family Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome you here for tonight's event, The Transformative Power of Women, a conversation with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Tonight would not be possible without the support of two women in particular. So please join me in thanking Policy School Board member Carol Wallace and Maureen Grace for co-sponsoring this important evening conversation. At the School of Public Policy, we endeavor to prepare leaders who put the public back into public policy. The field of public policy can be seen in coldly rational terms, big data, charts, graphs. But on the ground, politics and policy are the very humane practices of deciding how we will live together. It was James Madison in Federalist 51 who asked, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" The study of public policy can also be detached from the very real actions individuals have taken throughout history in accordance with this same human nature, for good and for evil. One of America's only graduate policy schools based at a Christian university, Pepperdine takes the moral dimensions of policy and leadership very seriously. The Bible itself is replete with heroes, men and women who spoke truth to temporal powers based on their courage and their belief in divine powers. Tonight's speaker knows something of courage. For almost 3 decades, Ayaan Hirsi Ali has spoken out for the rights of women and girls living under oppressive religious, cultural, and political systems. Many of you know her amazing biography by now. Born in Somalia, she was pledged to be married to a distant cousin in Canada in 1992, but escaped to the Netherlands in the midst of that trip. Gaining asylum there, she earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Leiden. Getting involved in politics, she was eventually elected to the Dutch Parliament in 2003, where she served for 3 years. Ayaan has worked across sectors and across media platforms in the defense of the civil rights of women and girls. In 2004, she came to the international prominence working with Theo Van Gogh on the film Submission, about which Van Gogh was later murdered and Ayaan's life was threatened. Ayaan continues her filmmaking as she remains a prolific author, writing a number of best-selling books, including her own story, Infidel, along with Nomad and the recent The Challenge of Dawa. Today, she is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and the founder and president of the AHA Foundation, which, as her website says, and I quote, believes in liberty for all. That means liberty from female genital mutilation, honor violence, and forced marriages. And it means liberty to challenge the ideology of Islamism, extremism that threatens Western civilization with rational Enlightenment thought. Unquote. As you'll see tonight, Ayaan makes these arguments in a clear and winsome way. In a series of Thanksgiving essays for Time magazine in 2014, Ayaan contributed her own essay writing, quote, "This Thanksgiving, I am grateful for the things we take for granted as women living in democratic countries such as the United States." She concluded saying, quote, "For us women in the U.S., in the West, we take all these rights for granted. We have an obligation to help our fellow women in small and big ways," unquote. Tonight, Ayaan, we are thankful for you for joining us here at the School of Public Policy. The format for tonight's discussion will begin with remarks from Ayaan, Then she will join Seaver College alum, SPP board member, and principal of Wallace Global Impact, Charity Wallace, in conversation for about 20 to 25 minutes. We will conclude with some written questions from you, the audience. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Pepperdine, Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Thank you so much. How can I do this? How can you, how can I respond to this? What a warm welcome. What a great, great pleasure and a great privilege to be back at Pepperdine. I was here a few years ago, and I came back again nervous. I remember here being with J.Q. Wilson. He was our host, and I came with people like Mark Stein, Douglas Murray. I don't know if you know these people. We gathered here and talked about all sorts of things and how to change the world. The idea was about free speech, and about 6 p.m., we all went to what we thought was a reception room, and we asked for a drink, and we were told, no, it's a dry campus. And it's still a dry campus. I know my British friends would say, if there's one thing you want to change about Pepperdine. But on the other hand, given what's going on in the rest of the world, all the opioids and all the turmoil with addiction, maybe we should just keep it dry. I want to thank, of course, Dean Peterson and the School of Public Policy for having me over and for the kind words he said. I also want to thank Charity Wallace, who I admired from a very long time and is, in my view, a powerhouse in her own right, and she is transformative. And I'm humbled that I get to have a conversation with her in front of you. I hope I don't disappoint you. Charity sent me a bunch of questions, lots of them. I don't think we would have had enough time to answer those questions tonight. They were all good questions. They were all important questions. And I picked one question because I thought it combined everything that I could get out in 25 minutes, which is just as much time as I have before we have our conversation, my conversation with her and my conversation with you. And the question she asked, which is the question I get all the time, everywhere I go, is, based on your experience, what do you think is the most important and best ways to ensure that girls and women are empowered, number one? That have, and how can we enhance access to greater opportunities, and how would that help society? So I see it in three ways. The question is divided into sharing my experience with you, talking to you about then how I have come to my views of empowering women, and how would that help? I've been talking about my experience for such a long time, and I'm utterly, totally bored with it. I'm even annoyed by people when they ask me about it. Every single time, are you from Somalia or Ethiopia? I just yawn internally. And I think, oh, come on, please. But I've decided, tonight I'm going to share with you 3 negatives and 3 positives. The negatives from my life experience. I'm pushing 50, so it's been a long time. The 3 negatives. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. I grew up in poor societies, not just one, but at least 3. And when I was very young, Islamist fanatics entered into my community. And as a teenager, I remember they took over our moral system. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. My father and mother didn't get along. My mother never planned to have her children. She was the second wife of my father. My father never planned anything except his politics. He was a very passionate man, very romantic about what he thought the world would look like. And in doing so, he had all these wives and he abandoned them and didn't realize what it took to raise children. I was exposed, like my siblings, to a lot of physical abuse. We were beaten at home, we were beaten at school. I remember going through days and weeks where we thought we just don't have enough food. I was very scrawny. It annoys me now when I wake up and think I have to lose weight, and I look back to those days and I think, gosh, I wish we had that much food. But you see how far I've come. So a dysfunctional family. Nothing was planned, nothing was au propos. And this dysfunctional family was ensconced, like many other families that had been rendered dysfunctional because of the societies we were in. Very poor, violent. We went at each other's throats. And institutions such as the family, the education system, the religious institutions, but political systems were either not developed at all, or if they were very, very weak. You have daycare. I know, that we have daycare in America because now I have children, and I think, oh yeah, they go to daycare. And you don't realize that it is an institution unless you reflect on these poor societies. And our daycare was we would be sent to the Quran school, where they would tie us up and beat us up and have us memorize religious texts in a language we didn't understand. And if we couldn't repeat it, then, the whole cycle repeated itself. You were punished, you were beaten, you were set in the sun, you were deprived. And in those Quran schools, it wasn't just the beatings and the psychological abuse, there was also sexual abuse. But then if you went home and you complained as a child about how bad things were at school, you would listen to your mother saying, but look at what this country has done. We've no food. We've nowhere to go. My husband is gone. People are being taken out of their homes because they're suspected of being political dissenters. They're jailed. My father was jailed. My uncles were jailed. A lot of my relatives were killed. And when the grown-ups are talking about these big things as a child, when you come around and you say, I got a couple of lashes here and there, no one takes you seriously. So those were the negatives. Then the positives. The first positive as a girl was that I was sent to school. That was something unique. My father insisted that I go to school, that my sister go to school, so I got access to learning how to read and write. And when my family moved to Kenya, I got access to the English language, which is a talk in its own, because getting access to speaking German or French or some other obscure language, that's one thing. But learning to speak English is quite a different story. Another positive was the fact that my father abandoned our family. And even though that was a negative on a day-to-day basis for my mother, I reflect back and I think, oh my goodness, what if he hadn't left? Because if my father had been around, I would be like many of the other girls who were in my Quran school, in my neighborhood, in my school. And I would be married off at the age of 13, 14, 15. But when he came back and he decided it was time to marry me off, I was 22 years old. That's the equivalent of being hyper-sophisticated. By that time, I understood the world, I spoke English, I read novels, and when I found myself in the country of Germany and under the custody of my uncle on my way to Canada, instead of going there, I figured out how to take a train from Bonn to Amsterdam and ask for asylum. And the rest is history. So that's why I think of the fact that my father wasn't there ultimately as a positive. The third positive from my life experience is once I went to the Netherlands and now I live in the United States of America, I was exposed to societies that actually enshrined the rights of girls and women in law. It's the norm, it's a society. I know in America we have loads and loads of problems, and I know in Holland we had loads and loads of problems. Things like equal pay, men not doing their share of the housework, all terrible things. But to be exposed to a place as I was in 1992, when the man that I was married off came to claim his right, and I walked to the woman social worker who was in charge of that evening of the asylum seeker, and I told her, I'm busted. I have to go to Canada. And I told her the whole story, and she said, you're not busted. I will call the police, and unless you change your mind, the policeman is going to talk to the man that you're married off to, and he's going to tell him to go back to Canada. He's not going to have you. And that's exactly what happened. The conversation was, she is my property. And the policeman said, well, she's over the age of 18, and in the Netherlands, she's an individual of her own. And it was a good thing for that particular man who had lived most of his life in Canada to hear that the institutions of that particular country were saying, we are sending the state in the shape of the police to protect this woman from you. And he said, I will call the lawyers, I will call the tribes, I will do everything. And he got a very impassive, tall Dutch man with a little beard telling him, go ahead and do it. So that's my life experience. Now, how do I try? Obviously, there's so much packed into that. But how do I translate that into the second part of the question, which is all about empowerment? And there's so much about, empowerment, women's empowerment, this group's empowerment, that group's empowerment. I spent a lot of time thinking about empowerment. I think it's a very important concept, and I think that individuals should be empowered and should feel empowered. And I haven't quite. I won't tell you. It's not an Einstein level of thinking, but I've come to see empowerment in 3 ways. And the first is psychological empowerment. The second is material empowerment. And in my view, the third, and the one that is least discussed, is cultural and religious empowerment. So when I talk about psychological empowerment, I'm thinking of the development of the strength of mind for girls and for boys, for all human beings, the strength of mind to survive and to thrive. Now, in an ideal situation, every girl and every boy should have a father and a mother that help them survive and thrive. In my circle of friends, I have people who've actually done that. Somewhere in the audience is a man called Sam Harris and Annika Harris. And they have a daughter, Emma. And I think that that child is made and is empowered from the get-go, nutritional, affection, material, to survive and to thrive. But not all girl children belong to Sam and Annika. So what would I say to the girls who find themselves in contexts that they have no control over? And that is to say, I would develop the strength of mind, that you get up every morning pull yourself up by your bootstraps every morning. That you have to think life is worth living. What you're developing with the strength of mind is a strength of character. Because for those of us who are lucky enough to overcome that adversity, we then have to come to the conclusion not to think of ourselves as victims, but to think of ourselves as victors. This is all psychological. When you escape the beatings, the abuse, when you escape the context where you have nothing to say over yourself, even though that's what you're desperate for, and you find yourself in a context where you're actually in charge of your own life, then you're going to ask yourself on a psychological level, sooner or later, do I get trapped in resentment, in vengeance, and in anger? Am I going to spend when I got that freedom, those years, am I going to spend hating my parents and hating my brother and hating men and devising on how to take revenge, but coat it in the name of justice? Is that what I'm going to do? Or will I move on? Is it possible for society to advance? Is it possible for me to reflect not only on my days in that dysfunctional family of mine, but also to reflect on the days of my brothers? Am I able to see that my brother was beaten, that he was abandoned, that he was also subjected to the adverse consequences of that dysfunctional family? Can I empathize with my brother? Or do I look at him as a male and think, I hate you, I hate all men? I think if you want to develop strength of character and strength of mind, you'll come to the conclusion that if you go with hatred and vengeance and resentment, you're locking yourself up in a different kind of prison, even when you're free. You're looking at the world only through that prism of the power and the powerless. But then you're not powerless anymore. And you're able to shape your own future, and you're able to influence others. And what are you going to say? Let's get rid of men? Before I had a husband and children, I thought I was going to have a husband. And then I thought I was going to have a child. I thought I was going to have a daughter. And I wrote a letter to my unborn daughter. But then I got a son. And then I got another one. And so now as I look at these beautiful, innocent human beings, I'm told every day, what do you want me to do with these boys? And actually, the way we raise our girls is not different from the way we raise our boys. We have to give them just as much compassion and love and the tools to survive and to thrive and to be compassionate and to be chivalrous and to give. Then I get to that material level. Gosh, I sound like a pastor or something. I didn't mean to preach, but we live in these times. So on a material level, again, ideally, don't we want, for all individuals, girls and boys, girls, we say, think of the bottom rungs of the pyramid of Maslow: food, shelter, safety. Do you realize, ladies and gentlemen, sitting in this room, that there are millions and millions of human beings today who just can't take those three basic things for granted, who don't have enough food, who don't have enough shelter, safety, any sort of healthcare? And it's not just the refugees in Syria and the places where there is a lot of civic stuff, even places that go, pass for peaceful and stable. There's just not enough to eat for people, let alone for women. And families start to make choices, and they unfortunately come to the conclusion that they're going to give more to the boys than the girls. And so yes, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, all of them, it's very easy for them to come to the conclusion, let's just get the material stuff to these societies. Let's get the material stuff to the girls. And that's a very, very, very good thing. Because without food and without those basics, we can't even talk about psychology or any other thing. But it again come to the third point, which is the cultural level. And culturally, here, we think, oh, let's expose girls to culture. And people say, yeah, the arts, theater, music. And I think, yeah, that's really important. Let's expose them to the arts and music and culture. But that's not really what we are talking about when it comes to the cultures where girls and women are held back, and because girls and women are held back, those societies are held back. What we are talking about are the cultural and religious components. Let me spell it out. Think of the concept of child marriage. Think of honor violence. Girls that are, allegedly commit some kind, they wear makeup or they have a boyfriend or they have sex before marriage, and their families come to the conclusion that they should be killed or whipped, confined, subjected to all sorts of terrible things. Think of female genital mutilation. Girls' genitals are cut off as a preemptive to make sure that they don't get themselves into honor trouble. Girls are forced into marriage. Societies that think that polygamy is virtuous, it's a good thing. All of these things, they're defended in the name of culture, in the name of religion. Now, how do you have a conversation with these cultures without saying, your culture sucks? And so when American taxpayers, European taxpayers, let's say the developed world, where all of these things have been addressed and have been gotten rid of, when they're asked to give money to the poor, and you only talk about the material, you only talk about the psychological, but you leave the religious components out, how do you think you're going to get anywhere? How do we think we're going to get anywhere? I got myself out of the trouble I was in, the context that I was in, by coming to the conclusion that my own religion was holding me back. And once I got that, once that, you have that insight, you call it a power bulb that goes on, that's when I don't blame my brother, I don't blame my father, I don't think, okay, we're all in it together. So we have to talk about these cultural norms, we have to talk about these religious norms, we've got to call it by its name. And for decades and decades, international, national efforts have been underway in Europe and in America. And in Europe, in America, the religious and cultural components that were holding back women and therefore society were addressed. And that is why things moved forward. So let's do it in the rest of the world. And then I come to the final part of what we're supposed to be discussing tonight, what I was asked to discuss tonight, which is what is the benefit to society? Well, education is critical. When a girl goes to school and stays in school, and she gets married at an older age, she has fewer children, and more of those children survive because her body is more mature and it's more healthy. And children of educated mothers are more educated themselves, and they're healthier, and they're more successful. That should be a truism. That statement should be a truism, but it's not, in fact. This is a statement from some high-flying United Nations, World Health Organization. It's supposed to tell you, don't you see how awesome this is? Another truism. Investing in women yields one of the best returns on investment. So now our economic components, which is great. But at least once that insight is there, and you say that it is imperative to educate girls so that your society can flourish, then how on earth can we have these reports with that kind of language not discuss religion or cultural norms? Another truism. Women account for 50% of the global working age population. Not surprisingly, research shows that if women participate more equally in the economy, global GDP could increase by 20% or 12 trillion by 2025. Yet, despite recognition of the opportunity that women represent on virtually every global measure, women are more economically excluded than men. Right, but when are we going to talk about religion? When are we going to talk about culture? When are we going to talk about two Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, and their leadership, and say to them, you've got to give up Sharia? And as long as the World Health our country and the World Health Organization and the United Nations, as long as we don't say that openly and make that an open policy, then it's all just empty talk. And as citizens, as people who come together in universities to exchange ideas, I think that's what we should be pushing for. And when children come here from Muslim societies, like some of the students here, if we don't teach them that, so that they take that away and take it home, then I think we are failing to achieve that very same goal that we say we hope to achieve. I'm now going to end with the appeal that when I say, as girls and women, we should not demonize and dehumanize boys and men, it's the exact same logic that says, let's not demonize and dehumanize Muslims, Africans, South Asians, societies that seem to be stuck with those cultural and religious norms. It's not to demonize them or dehumanize them, they are fellow human beings. But it is to insist that when they choose to stick with those ideas, with those norms, then it is of no surprise that their societies get stuck there. Let's not apologize for what we have achieved here. The Islamists do not apologize for their ideas and their norms. Instead of apologizing for who we are and what we've achieved, I think we should not only celebrate it, but aggressively and intensely and assertively promote it. Even if that earns us accusations of racism, imperialism, Eurocentrism, and whatever else are the tools that are used to shut us up. I just refuse to shut up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayaan. It's a real privilege for me to be here tonight. I'm Charity Wallace, and I have the privilege of serving on the advisory board at the School of Public Policy. But I was a SEAVR graduate, and the last time I was on this stage, I was, I think, dancing across the stage in Dance in Flight. I'm so thrilled to be here with you tonight. It's a real privilege. I've read your books over the years. I've always had such admiration for your courage and for your life. And the theme of tonight is the transformative power of women. And you're the perfect example of that for us, and the courage that you've shown in your life and what you pursue today. So we're so thankful for you tonight. In thinking about, and I want to say thanks to Dean Peterson for hosting this evening and having us here tonight, and congratulations to the new president, Jim Gash, and our first female chancellor, Sarah Jackson. So we're thrilled that there's leadership at the top with women here at Pepperdine as well, which is great. So in thinking about your story, as I've said, it's truly incredible, and what you've experienced due to cultural and religious norms is sort of alarming in some ways. And I know that happens to women all over, but it also, we talked about the courage and how women find courage in different ways. And so again, your story, when I think about tonight's themes and I think about your story, I think about kind of three different themes. One is that women and girls face very difficult challenges globally. So Ayaan talked a little bit about the data, but your story is replicated over and over. And so we have to think about why is it important for us to invest in women and girls. Changing cultural norms and social behaviors is crucial for women and girls, and actually as well as boys and men in many countries as well, for us to thrive globally. And then your story is just a really excellent example of resilience and courage and overcoming just unthinkable challenges and obstacles for women and girls. So I'd like to talk a little bit about those things. And I, in my career, I've had the privilege of traveling with President and Mrs. Bush, which is where I first met you, actually, was in Dallas, Texas at the Bush Institute. Yes. And I got to travel to over 70 countries with them and really see the transformative power of women on the ground, and especially in the Middle East and North Africa. So when you were talking tonight, obviously wanted to talk about your story, but also the cultural change that we've talked about, the cultural and religious behavioral change that needs to happen. So can you unpack that a little bit more, thinking about the transition that happened in your own life? I know that your father had a conversation with you and said, how did you come to these beliefs?
Yeah.
And so can you unpack that a little bit for us, and thinking about why is it so important, and what really will it take to have that change?
Well, I can talk about my perspective, where I think I'm trapped in a situation. First of all, growing up, I watched my mother. She's this desperate woman. She can't put food on the table. Her husband is absent. She's always angry. She's in a different country every so many years. She doesn't speak the language. Right. And then it's my mother's perspective was, it's all Allah's will. God is punishing me for something. And I watch that, and I think when I come of age, so when it's time for me to get married, and my father says, this is the man you're going to get married, I just think, oh, I'm going to repeat my mother's life. I'm just going to be as powerless and as helpless, and I don't want to be that. And so there's my mother thinking it's God's plan, that he wanted to punish her that way. Then it's my plan. I don't want to live that way, and if I can get out of it, I'll get out of it. And then there's my father's perspective, and my father's perspective is a number of things. First of all, he's just terrified of my sexuality. What if she ends up, damaging the family honor? Because me being sexually active doesn't just impact me, it impacts the entire clan. Right. And my whole family would be shunned forever for doing that. So there's that one perspective, and my mom is supposed to be the guardian of that. And she says, oh, but then he was absent, so that's the quarrel they have. But he also thinks this marrying me off is going to protect me, so he thinks he's done the right thing. And so ultimately, the conversation after I escape is that I have to prove to them I'm not going to do anything that is going to dishonor the family. I don't become a prostitute. I don't become the things that they were terrified of. Right. And 5 years away from the family, I was being asked, can you send us money? And I was sending them money. Right. And I was saying, I earn this money from cleaning, factory works, translation, etc. So it has nothing to do with my sexuality. And there's something about perhaps all religions, but very specifically the religion of Islam, that just somehow is so terrified of female sexuality that they've developed an elaborate law to do nothing other than put them in burqas, lock them up. And I've had conversation after conversation, why? And it dawned on me, it's not women's sexuality that they're so afraid of, it's maybe men's sexuality. Because men go out and misbehave, and when men misbehave, they say, well, it's the women who caused it, and they're just stuck in this. There's this man called Kamal Daoud, of Algerian descent. He's French, and he's written so eloquently about it from a male perspective, and it's very, very, it makes me cry, because he reveals that it is just terrible for men as well. And it is something that we all need to break out of. But these are the conversations, the relentless conversations that I was having with my father and mother, and my mother, not much of a conversation, but when I had these conversations with my father, I thought we were getting somewhere. But the more I had the conversations, the more I thought, don't back away, don't back down. You know, they say, actually they run out of arguments and you're blaspheming. Muhammad this, Muhammad that, and he lived in the 7th century. You can't be following someone in the 7th century. You can't say that. I can say it, but I'm thinking it. If I'm thinking it, can I say it? No, you can't say it, but it's still a sin. It doesn't matter whether I say it or think it, I'm still going to hell, so if I'm going to hell. So that's the kind of, it gets to that point, but then you get to that point of levity, and I think the next generation breaks through because they see that it's illogical, it's stuck in time, and the misery it's causing.
Are there examples of countries or societies that you believe have sort of made that transition, or the cultural, social change that you are hoping for?
So I'm married to a British man, and every time I say, oh my goodness, this is happening, he says, it used to happen in Scotland, was worse. And England was worse, and this, that, and the other. And so then we read through, and you know what manifests itself? That they did have to challenge Christianity. They had to challenge not just the Catholic Church, but all the various Protestant churches. They wrote a great deal of beautiful literature about it, and poems, and made movies about it, and they still wallow in, you know, how it was 100 years ago here, and 50 years ago, and so on. But if you don't take those institutions on, you don't move forward, and that is my one up on him is, but you guys faced it, and we're still facing it, and you are in the way. And he says, I'm not.
And I think about taking on institutions.
So basically, to answer the question of are there countries who have done that? Yes, there are countries who have done that, and some of them in big ways, the Western countries, some of them in small ways. So think about infanticide, the fact that in many parts of the world, they value baby boys more than they value baby girls. So in China, they still engage, some parts of China, not all parts of China, engage in just not wanting babies, and now they use various technologies to abort once they discover that they're pregnant with a baby. It's not only in China, it's also in India. But there's one country at some point that decided, South Korea, that they weren't going to do that. They came to understand why that was such a terrible idea, and a terrible tradition, and a terrible custom. And I don't know if they justified it in the name of religion or not, but it was definitely custom. They abandoned that, and South Korea now, in terms of the male-female ratio, is the healthiest population in all of Asia. It is the only country where they don't have a shortage of women.
That's right. It's alarming, actually, about China, because if there's this one-child policy and the idea is that they don't want girls, now there's a lot of men and no women.
And no women.
In China.
Yeah.
So in thinking about, actually, when you were talking about institutions and the quality of debate and the reasons why we need to do it, so you were invited to Brandeis, disinvited to Brandeis.
Yeah.
When we think about Pepperdine, and one of the things that, you know, that Pepperdine stands for is the opportunity for us to debate and debate truth.
Yeah.
And I'm going to actually read exactly what it says on the website. It says, truth, having nothing to fear from investigation, should be pursued relentlessly in every discipline.
Yeah.
So let's talk about why debate, discussion, pursuit of providing opportunities like tonight and other ideas is important in these kinds of settings, and what you hope to achieve with that as well.
Well, the history of universities, higher education, is the history of critical thinking in the West. And if you're going to engage in critical thinking, you're obviously going to put question marks on what's dear and close to the hearts of people. And the whole point is it's reasoned discussion. You're not going to believe anything. You start with, you know, I remember going to my first class at the University of Leiden, which I was told was the oldest, but may not be true, you're here at this institution, welcome. The auditorium pretty much looked exactly like this. And here's what, in the next 4 years, what's going to guide us. We're going to make a distinction between what is, what should be, and then the prescriptive, how we can change that. But we'll never, ever get to the prescriptive and the normative unless we recognize what is. And with Brandeis, and in the present context where we live, what we are seeing, and I think it's alarming, as students who are saying, I don't want to know what is, I don't want to see what is, and professors who are either encouraging it or are too scared to do or say anything about it. And that nullifies, in my view, the point of what a university, what a college degree is all about. If you don't recognize what is, I'm going to give you a very controversial point, and I may never be welcomed to Pepperdine again, or any other university. But as far as we know, the biologists, scientists, as far as science tells us, there are only two genders, male and female. I know, I'll never be invited anywhere else. Now, what do? I empathize with people who are saying, I think I'm somewhere in the spectrum between male and female. When I use the word empathy, that's a feeling. I empathize with that. I also don't want to stand in their way. And I think you should live your life the way you want to live your life. But now you're asking me to negate what is, as far as we know and as far as we can tell. And universities should not indulge in that unless we get to a point where you can prove your case empirically. But you can't fight with empirics. It's like saying the law of gravity doesn't hold.
Right.
Because there's some spectrum somewhere and start dropping out of the sky, and there isn't much of a spectrum there.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we're going to actually invite the audience to write questions down. So there should be cards, I believe, that you can pass. I think there's a team out there that's going to help collect cards in the next 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to continue to have a conversation, and then we're going to be taking audience Q&A as well. Because it is important for us to have these conversations. I think it's really important for us at universities to have conversations. I love the idea of what is.
What is, yeah.
Exactly. And so when we look around the world, and you've talked about what is reality, and then how do you change that and transform that reality. So if you're looking at, for instance, like the Arab Spring, so Egypt, Tunisia, thinking of those countries, do you feel like there's a place for hope as far as shifting norms or new opportunities for women where they'll be able to really come into use their voice effectively, come into their roles?
I have hope. I'm optimistic. But again, I don't confuse my optimism, my confirmation bias with what is. What is we still have countries that have legal systems and cultural systems that hold everyone back. They hold women back more than men, but they also hold men back.
That's right.
I also see a pushback, and of course that, I get optimistic and I get excited. I was very excited by the Arab Spring. I'm very much excited, believe it or not, by what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is doing. I don't mean, slicing up journalists in foreign consulates. What I mean is when he says he has this plan 2030, and he wants to modernize the Saudi economy, and he wants to bring the West in. I think through the implications of what he's saying, and I look at what he is, and I ask myself, what exactly is he doing to meet that? And I see some of the things he's doing, and I think, okay, I can allow myself to be optimistic about that. And if that country, by the way, changes for the better, we're looking at some good things. But I also see it's going to take them time, and there is a huge, huge opposition to any form of modernization from the Wahhabi establishment. And as long as they don't have that internal discussion, or when they have it, things get worse rather than better, then I lose my optimism. I look at a country like Iran, and I look at the population, and I know how incredibly forward-looking they are, and I'm very optimistic about that. I'm looking at what is. But then there's this regime that is holding everything down, that is about to start a war, that is proclaiming to destroy Israel. And I think, wow, will the people of Iran really get a chance to the next level, the normative, where they really want to be? And then I look at our own societies and our own, messed up politics, and I think, wow, I don't know if we can help them. Because 10 years ago, it was like, what can the US do for the world? And now it's like, wait a second, what can we do for ourselves to just stay stable and not look like those countries?
That's right, exactly. Yeah. In thinking about Iran and where they are with the sanctions, that's changed the internal politics in some ways. I think people are really wanting to have more freedom. Obviously, people are very upset by what's going on. The regime is holding people down. And then when you think of Afghanistan in the 70s, women actually were not covered. They were in school. And then think of how quickly that shift happened and the 30 more plus years of war that they've experienced. So the idea, and Mrs. Bush often said, and there's actually research that shows that where women are treated poorly, men are treated poorly as well, but it also takes away the peacefulness and the stability and prosperity of a country. So the idea is if women are treated badly, prosperity and stability goes down in countries, and therefore the world. So that's one of the reasons why we're really pushing for women to have a voice and to
No, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I wholeheartedly agree with it. Even if you hold the, incredibly conservative view that women should only be wives and mothers, if you have a wife that is angry and full of resentment, and a mother who's having a baby every single year, can't give enough attention to any of the babies. I mean, think about that household. Or think about the 11-year-old or the 12-year-old, 13-year-old who is forced to marry. It's arranged, it is forced, whatever you call it, and starts having children at a very early age, and it pops out one after the other, doesn't have enough attention for. So even in those hyper-orthodox contexts, it's empirically visible that when you have that, you have mothers, families, children that all miss out on their potential, on what they could have been. What if that mother actually finished school and then she could educate her sons? So in those societies, if you care about boys, but boys are mothered by women who are actually incapable of being proper mothers, then you have the whole society, you're tagging the whole society down. And I think more and more people are seeing this. But some of the more privileged families out there deal with it by sending their sons to school here. And I wish we could say, it's okay, we will let your kids come here to school, but let their mothers come and their sisters come.
That's right.
Or a quantum of, these are the number of girls we're going to have.
That's right. And it's interesting when you talk about mothers, and you talked about this about education. So we know that when girls put off getting married and they go to school even 2 years longer, they have fewer children, their children are more educated, and their families are more prosperous and stable.
It's empirical.
And mothers also have an influence on what they teach young boys and girls. And so if there is a sense that they have some power and agency, there's a difference in that family.
And they're informed.
That's exactly right.
I mean, we live in a world that is incredibly complex. So just even for us in the first world, we have to look at how many schools. So you've got to visit every school, and then what curriculum or what. So if you're uninformed and your child is competing with the children of the mothers who are informed, your children will be backward. And it's pointless to say, oh, they are powerful, they are the imperialists, they are the colonialists, they are the Jews, they are the Americans, boo-hoo-hoo. You can say that, but if you don't emancipate your women, you'll never catch up.
That's right, yeah. What are the biggest challenges that facing your work right now?
The biggest challenges? Identity politics is a huge challenge. I often don't understand what they're on about. To me, it's just, it gets to the level of luxury. I don't know if it makes, and you know Marie Antoinette, and she looked down, and people were protesting in France, and they told her it's about bread, and she said, why can't they have cake? So to me, it's that level. Identity politics just right there. It is, these people are, I want a safe space. I don't want to read Homer. Shakespeare was a misogynist, and I think, God, I just shake my head and think, what is this all about? They want to tear down statues. Look, the Me Too movement started with, I would say, some very good and legitimate complaint. If you go to work as a woman, you should be treated, you know, and you should feel safe, and it's not about your sexuality. You should not be groped. You should not be raped. You should not be made to feel that unless you sleep with the boss, you will not be promoted. These are very good, very legitimate issues. And I'm 100% behind that. But now it's morphed into something else altogether that right. It's just not legible to me.
That's right.
Yeah, and completely gone wrong. And that's, I would say, the most challenging.
The most challenging.
Yeah, because you're still using the language of emancipation, the language of reason. Mm-hmm. We want to emancipate, we want to move forward. I don't want to diminish anyone's pain. But when people come up with, I don't want to read so-and-so's book because I'm triggered or I'm preemptively right. offended, I just think, right,
exactly.
Expel it. Yeah.
So we're going to start.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to start taking audience questions. So this is from Lindsay. She said, how can the West help with reformation of Islam?
Yeah.
What can we do specifically? And lastly, she really wants you to be her best friend forever.
The middle question is just, it's the critical thinking. I just really think we should be giving an example in critical thinking and not back down. Not back down. Last year, I was astounded the way things ended up when the Washington Post journalist was hacked to death. And I thought, you know, they were going to be brought to justice. There was going to be some kind of consequence. And now it's a year later, and there's none. And that's where critical thinking ends. You know, there were some senators who were saying, oh, they're barbarians, the crown prince is crazy. Great, but nothing happened.
What do you think should have happened?
I think that was the moment to hold Saudi Arabia accountable, not only for that particular murder, but for all the terrible things that they've been in the promotion of Wahhabism. They have a ministry of, they call it Al-Waqf, and the budget of that ministry is all about nothing else but to promote Wahhabism. I would have demanded that they stop it. I would, on the punishment of that they never have any relationship with America. You know, free press in their own country, freedom of speech, women's rights. These are the values that we say we uphold. These are the values that we say we promote. And for whatever reason, the whole thing just fizzled out. And that, I think, it's not, the West is not being held back by the rest. The West is holding itself back. We've come to the terrible conclusion, totally misguided, that self-restraint is to let things get out of hand.
Yeah, that's so true. Okay, the next question is from Taylor. It says, what is the scariest thinking you see emerging in the American culture based on what you've come from?
Navel gazing. Navel gazing, yeah. It's all me, ma. It's boo-boo. It's just, for me, you know, I'm talking to you about kids who were married off at age 9, 8. I'm talking to you about people who are being flogged. And I'm talking to you about life and death matters. And then I open a newspaper and it is, I'm suffering from psychological this, that, or the other because someone groped me when I was 9 years old. I just think, 20 years ago. So someone groped someone 20 years ago, and I think, why don't you just slap his hand off? Shouldn't we be teaching little girls that right now, that when something like that happens, you stand up to that person, you say, stop it. And you report to your teacher, your mother, other girls, you know, take them on, call them out, but don't say, I've been in therapy for it for 20 years. Because, again, I'm not diminishing it. I'm not diminishing it, but the good old death stare and the slap, nothing wrong with that. You just go, stop it.
That's right, exactly.
And it happens, and it's a bad thing. I mean, it is. I've been a woman. I'm still a woman.
You've been a woman all your life.
I've been a woman all my life, but when I find myself in those situations, and with girlfriends, we say, did you see what so-and-so was doing? And it's awful, you frown, and if you think it's actually stopping you, you can't function, you do really say something about it. And do something about it, and you hold your entire environment accountable. Please raise your hand if your daughter or your wife or your sister or any female friend came to you and said, this is happening to me at work. What would you do? Would you raise your hand if you would blame her? Raise your hand if you would support her. That's the West. That's what I'm talking about. That's America. That's the big difference. If I came home in Somalia or Afghanistan, when I said, some man touched me, I would be told, where were you? Why were you where the man touched you? So it's your fault. And if our daughters and our teenagers don't know that we can rely on their support, then we're doing something wrong. And yes, universities are doing something wrong. But the answer is not to falsely accuse young men and ruin their careers. It is not to go around campus carrying a mattress. It is not, absolutely not, to retreat into some kind of safe space. It is to stand up to bad behavior if you see bad behavior.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So good. So John would like to know, why do you think extremist Islam attracts so many people, and what can be done about it?
I think there are so many different reasons for that, but I will say extremist Islamists, they give you a binary worldview. You don't have to think for yourself. All the answers are given. You just have to follow. In that sense, they're not different from any of those other worldviews that offer that kind of binary worldview. And the people you don't like, the people that you have the in and the out. So the people who don't opt in, they're your enemies, they're the infidels. You try to convert them, and if you can't, then you're hostile to them, and then you try to kill them. But it is so blank that it takes critical thinking away from. You don't have to struggle with moral issues. You don't have to struggle with how to live with your neighbors and people with other worldviews. You don't have to struggle with your sexuality. Everything is spelled out for you. And unfortunately, we do live in a world where so many people, especially so many young men, feel dislocated. And Islam is just tapped. They really take advantage and exploit these young, vulnerable.
And there's loss of hope, sometimes because the economics are so bad in a country. There's loss of purpose. There's lots of belonging.
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was a teenager and the Muslim Brotherhood came into our community, my brother dropped out of school. And my mother and the other women in the neighborhood were all in despair about their young teenage boys. Fathers were absent. You have teenage boys, they're dropping out of school, they're getting into trouble, they're taking drugs, their future looks bleak. And then the Islamists come in, and suddenly these young men are not taking drugs, they're not drinking, they're not chasing girls, they are neat and tidy, they're praying 5 times a day, they're helping with charity and everything else, and people get attracted to that, and so do the young men. And it's only a decade later that you hear about jihad and the Al-Shabaab and these boys dying and offering themselves for that ideology. In this case, they're told it's for God. And so it is attractive to. This is why critical thinking is so key. And it doesn't matter. The communities I'm talking about were poor, but you can also have communities that are perfectly wealthy. But if you shut off the faucet of critical thinking, then young people won't be able to stand up to these people and say, what you're saying to me is rubbish. You're asking me to kill people, you're asking me to be intolerant, you're asking me to, and pull themselves away and pull their friends out of it. You can't, instead of it being a small sect or a small cult, it becomes this global threat.
How do you think we perpetuate critical thinking? Because I feel like now there's so much in social media, kids sort of memorize things rather than really think analytically about an answer.
Yeah.
You know, those types of things. How in our time in society, you know, in the West and beyond, how do you think that we actually promote
well,
critical
in the West,
thinking?
we have the infrastructure.
Right.
And I think if professors were to teach about ideas about critical thinking, what the difference between what it is, a normative and a prescriptive, and you give also, actually, if I taught a class and a student said, I'm triggered by a certain book, that's exactly the book I would give them to read. Because that's critical thinking. That is telling them, well, why don't you set your emotions aside, read the book and tell me what it is that triggers you. But what's happening, so we actually have, in Western universities, we have in place, at least I think we do, the curriculums, the infrastructure for doing that. But then when the students demand that they don't want to know, we indulge that. Mm-hmm. And I absolutely don't understand why we do that, and then saddle them with all this debt. So by the time they leave school, they have about $100,000 in debt or more, and
right.
They're incapable of critical thinking.
Exactly.
I mean, talk about a scam. Seriously.
So true. Oh my goodness. Okay, Gary's asking, why do you think feminists have not embraced you or your cause and story, and frankly, heroism?
Because they bought into identity politics, because a lot of feminists, not all feminists, like Camille Paglia, Christina Hoff Sommers, they don't do that. But there are a bunch of feminists that have bought into this whole identity politics thing who think they have no right to talk about the misogyny of the brown man or the black man, I'm coming to feminism, well, as a new person, and I thought it was for all women. Mm-hmm. If it's for all women and you're decrying the misogyny of white men, then you should decry the misogyny of all other men. Mm-hmm. But there's an element of that, and I think there's also an element of white guilt. I'm not an expert on that, but my colleague Shelby Steele at Hoover, he's written a lot about it, and he's shown so many different examples of how this whole thing creeps into people's minds and how they feel. I'm a descendant of the people who were enslaved by sharing a color, skin color. They weren't even slaveholders, just by having a white skin. So if I have a white skin, then I have no place to talk about the misconduct of others and the misogyny and the discrimination of others, of people who don't have a white skin. And I think if that is how we want to divide our world, then it's terrible, because to me that is the true meaning of racism. Mm-hmm. I thought we were one humanity, and it doesn't. My skin color is irrelevant, and so is your skin color. It's. Was it Martin Luther King who said it's the quality of your character? Mm-hmm. That's what we should aspire to.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, just in thinking about the women's movement. Oftentimes, more conservative women are not thought to be experts or part of the women's movement, or aren't invited to participate in things that are so-called women's movement or feminists. And it's the idea that a lot of, number of women leaders have said is women's rights are human rights. Yeah. And that translates in every background, in every culture.
Right.
So Kathy's asking, did you ever have doubts about speaking so bluntly about she says, inferiority of some cultures?
Did I ever have doubts about speaking about the inferiority of cultures? I always have doubts, I would say, about the unintended consequences of what I say and what I do, and I listen very, very carefully to, when people take that up and say, do you know that if you say it this way, the skinheads, the white supremacists are going to take advantage of that. And then I think about it, and if I think that's the case, then I will adjust my language. But sometimes with some groups, I have come to the conclusion it doesn't matter how you say it. I'll give you one example. You've all heard of the term Islamophobia. So every time when the word Islamophobia is hurled at me, I obviously do not deny that individuals of the Muslim faith have been confronted with abuse. Abuse because fellow Muslims do things that are terrible, but the people who are being abused are completely innocent. But I wouldn't call that Islamophobia. And I think the people who do that should be punished and confronted with the full might of the law. But very often, Islamophobia is used to silence, the exposure of child marriage, or honor violence, or Sharia law. And if I'm talking about Sharia law and good faith, these are the people who are suffering under Sharia law, and Islamophobia is hurled at me, then I think, well, that's just an instrument to silence me. So yeah, I obviously have to think very carefully about what I say, how I say it, and who I'm saying it to. I'm also very aware of the experience that people have, like the Muslim individuals who are abused, and what can we and what should we do about it. But I'm not prepared to drop the cause altogether for fear, that my words are going to help the wrong people. I think, I could be wrong, please tell me, but that my role in talking about these things is going to help the victims of Sharia more than they will help the the perpetrators of white supremacy. And that's just a trade-off I have to make every day, and it's a trade-off you have to make every day.
So we have time, we have only a couple more minutes. So I want to know what makes you feel hopeful for the future.
Yeah. Well, my life, look where I am and where I was. Every day I go to bed thinking how grateful I am. And if I've made this journey and I see more people write to me, I've now got more Muslim friends and Muslims from my background. I just ran, walking into here, I ran into a young Somali woman, Sahra, that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, who said just wonderful things and said that she was going to write about her own story and she wants to fight. Mm-hmm. And it's people like that who make me optimistic. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that. The book Educated, a Mormon woman goes through all that, comes out of it, is able to tell the whole story and what that does for all of us. It just makes you could be feeling sorry for yourself, and then you read about the story of someone else who's actually suffered more than you did, and that makes you optimistic. Mm-hmm. I'm a classical liberal also. Classical liberalism is all about optimism.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. Keeps us going.
There was a time when slavery was enshrined in law, and the people who were fighting to end it, they were looked at as fools. Mm-hmm. And I think, look where we are now.
That's right.
And there was the Holocaust, and the survivors of the Holocaust have taught us so much. Look where we are now. We are facing a lot of problems, don't get me wrong. But if you are not optimistic, if you convince yourself, and this is what I say to some of the women who keep complaining, if you convince yourself that there's absolutely no point in living, there's no point in fighting, there's no point in advancing, then you're not just displaying a sense of individual depression, but you're also depressing everyone else. So I think our job, for those of us who are optimistic, is to say there's always that silver lining. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you have to always look at it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's a great note to end on.
To end on.
Yes.
Thank
and
you.
it's just that there is silver lining. And thank you so much for the inspiration that you are to us and for the courage. And thanks for attending this evening and sharing about your life and your hope for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ayaan.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here this evening. As I've said on more than a few occasions, the School of Public Policy has two visions. One is inside the classroom, preparing our next generation of public leaders who can work across sectors and can work across the aisle to understand their perspective as well as the others. The other vision is displayed in nights like tonight. To understand, as I've recently just learned, this was the first time Ayaan Hirsi Ali has spoken on a college campus in at least 3 years. And it's my vision that the School of Public Policy continues to be that home for speakers who think rationally, thoughtfully, about issues that we care so deeply about: liberty, freedom, and the moral sense. I thought it was interesting that the last time Ayaan was here in Malibu, it was at the invitation of James Q. Wilson. As some of you know, James Q. Wilson was really one of the founding fathers of the School of Public Policy when he moved out here to Malibu from Harvard over 20 years ago. He had moved here and gotten involved in helping to design our curriculum after writing the book, The Moral Sense, which seemed as a rather interesting book for a hardened social scientist to write. But in that book, The Moral Sense, he essentially lays out the understanding that there needs to be a humanity as part of public policy, something that we think, as I said before, so quantitatively about. We also have to understand that the public side of public policy involves real people living in times and places, people that need to display courage, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali obviously does in her life and is making an impact upon the world. And so again, I want to thank you for coming here tonight. Our next big event will be down in Orange County, exploring the overweening role the federal government is taking in our local policies. That will be on October 16th. And then on November 15th, we will be welcoming our Ronald Reagan professor to the Reagan Library, Dr. Bill McClay, and his new book, Land of Hope. He will be talking about civics education and the importance of teaching history in a narrative form in a way that connects us with our country and the amazing experiment that is the American experiment. We are going to adjourn from here. You're welcome. We are serving refreshments out the door and to your right. If you're not on our mailing list, please reach out to Melissa Espinoza or to me. If you're interested in supporting further nights like this, we ask that you understand and feel firsthand the transformative power of women by meeting our Chancellor, Sarah Jackson, who is here this evening as well. So again, thanks so much for joining us here tonight. We hope to see you again at a future unique evening conversation.